Today we're going to talk about writing the news release, and you might have heard others use the term press release. They're used synonymously, right? So I'm going to do that throughout the course of this lecture, but know that news release and press release, we're referring to the same thing. Okay. The nice thing about the news release is that, one, it's been around for over 100 years. It is recorded that Ivy Lee, who's widely lauded as the grandfather of public relations, wrote the first press release back in 1906. So we know that, like I said, it is tried and true. This is a standard public relations tactic. It's cost effective because it's free. It just costs your time, right? So the time it takes you to organize your thoughts, to conduct some interviews, to get some quotes, we'll talk about all of that and how that ends up in the press release. But really, after that, there is no additional cost. They're time efficient because once you've written a couple, you kind of they end up being very formulaic. So once you understand the basic template and the format, then you're in good shape. It tends to be pretty quick in terms of your writing. But the problem with this is that there's really, really fierce competition. Acknowledge that some editors in large markets, if we're thinking New York, LA, Boston, for example, they're receiving up to 2,000 press releases a day. So we know that there isn't room to publish or present anywhere near that amount of information. So we know that just because you write a press release, it doesn't mean that that information is going to be picked up by a traditional news outlet like television or a newspaper, or now through bloggers. But what we're going to talk about today are some tips that can help you to be positioned for greater success. So if you follow the formula, if you work within the template, if you're really strategic and mindful about your lead and what you include in the press release, you have greater chances of having an editor pick it up and decide to share it with his or her own audience. The value here of the press release is that one, especially now if we're thinking traditional media, when a number of news outlets are kind of working with a bare bones staff because we're not publishing as frequently and circulation is nowhere near as wide as it used to be. Press releases in a lot of ways have become the basis for a majority of the news stories that you're reading, right? So editors are looking at this information that's being sent to them. You'll see in a few minutes, I've already suggested that press releases have quotes embedded within them. So all of that goes into making a strong story, right? And we make sure that our contact information is there and that we're always accessible to our journalists and bloggers so we can fill in the blanks with other accurate, credible information. And then all of a sudden, we have done our job. Right? The information we were hoping the news media picked up, they did. As I suggested on the previous slide, cost effective, aside from the cost of your time and your energy, it doesn't have any financial cost associated. And the other nice thing is it can help you achieve your organizational objectives. So when you were working last week to do your client research report, you talked about some of the objectives and the goals that you want your client to accomplish this semester through a public relations communication campaign. Press release is a tactic that helps you to achieve those goals. So whether it is figuring out how we get more people to attend events or get them to aware of our new products or service lines, press releases are a really nice vehicle in doing that. Fierce competition, right? So we acknowledge that editors can receive up to 2,000 press releases daily. I recently read a quote that 50 to 90% of press releases, so it greatly depends on where you are in terms of that percentage. So again, if we're thinking of really high, dense, saturated markets, New York, LA, Boston, It's probably more closer to 90% aren't getting in. But there are some very, very simple things you can do to increase your odds and the odds of your organization or your client being published through a press release. So, one, there is not room for creativity in the press release. And that kind of pains me to say because being a public relations practitioner or professional communicator, we tend to rely on creativity as a means to attract attention, to brand ourselves, to demonstrate who we are as an organization. But the press release, very, very formulaic. So if you learn it and you can work within that formula and that template, you're much more likely to be successful. The other thing is, and I've mentioned this in other lectures, and you'll hear it in future lectures going forward, we always have to answer the what's in it for me question for our audience, right? If we're not answering why this is important, how it's going to impact their life, essentially why they need to take the time to read this information, they themselves are not going to read the information. So we have to answer all of the questions to them and find a way to demonstrate how it is personally relevant. And that also goes into the case, we'll talk at the end of this lecture about pitching to journalists and to bloggers. You need to answer that same question for them. Why should they read this? Why should they share this with their audience, with their stakeholders? Right? So in public relations, we are constantly seeking to answer that question for everyone we're interacting with. We're seeking to explain to them why they need this information. The other crux of the press release is that we're sending these out before something has occurred. Press releases, think of them as a, what is the word I want to use? Think of them essentially as an invitation. So if we're having an event, it gives journalists, bloggers, and even members of the community a chance to come out and participate with us. It's not a summary of what has happened. We will never send a press release after an event because that is old. It is not timely. It's in the past. So thinking about this again, this has to be based in news. Right? And we're going to talk about that. Press releases are based on hard news determinants. What that means is softer news, things that tend to be more of the feel-good stories, those are more likely to fit within a feature story than a news release or a press release. So as we acknowledge timeliness, so if we can tie in something our organization is doing to anything that's going on in current events, right, or anything that will be happening in the future, like we said, we're not sending out summaries and press releases. We're sending out an indicator, an acknowledgement of what is going to come. Human interest, sometimes we can do these. These tend to be a little bit in the gray zone in terms of, does this make sense for a press release or does this make more sense for a feature story? One way that I saw this done with human interest through a press release annually is, as I acknowledged, my last job in industry was working in a hospital. And every January 1st, we would send out a press release about the first baby of the new year, right? That's something that typically on January 1st, other news media outlets are looking for easier information, easier stories to share. So in that sense, and it was timely, it's this idea that someone started off the new year with this brand new baby, and as long as he or she is healthy, it becomes something that people can relate to. Community development is another reason we might issue a news release. Thinking especially in the Kalamazoo area, when we think about when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced several years ago, right? Definitely an occasion for a press release. Anytime your organization has a new product or a new service, Sometimes too, if you have a new hire, especially if this new hire is in the C-suite, so the a chief marketing officer, chief executive officer, chief financial officer, that is another reason to issue a press release. Economic issues, certainly, if we're thinking about what's going on in the economy, if we think about Britain exiting the European Union, for example, if your organization was somehow tied into that fabric of the economy, another reason to reach out to stakeholders. Sports, this is if you are in an organization where it makes sense that you issue a press release about sports. Universities, for example, perfectly positioned. If your organization is doing an internal team building day and you're having managers play against non-managers, probably not an occasion to issue a press release. And fashion, again, if this is something that pertains to your industry, your organization, or your client, actually several of you in class are doing fashion-based clients for this semester, so that's an example here. If we have a particularly well-known fashion designer coming to town, or they're doing something new with fabrics or some other type of fashion issue, then a press release might make perfect sense. Some other things that I want you to think about is here you're going to see the 5 W's. We're going to reference that. Oh, actually, we see a couple of them repeated. But we are always seeking to answer the who, what, where, when, and why. Okay. So before you start writing your press release, you'll see in the module I have a press release planning document. And I highly suggest you do that. I'm not going to ask you to submit it. If you do it, you're not going to get more points. If you don't do it, you won't get less points. But I do see every semester students who take the time to complete that virtually always earn higher grades on their press releases than students who don't. So I do think it will help you get organized for writing, and these questions will also. So it's the idea that we don't write a press release just because. So we just went over making sure that there are hard news determinants. So after we're able to check that box and say, yes, this in fact does have a hard news basis, then some questions I want you to think about are, what are we announcing? So this will help you gain clarity in making sure that if you have to know these products and services as well as those who create them, because you are put in the position in public relations to be that liaison or that bridge between the organization and stakeholders. So you need to have a fundamental grasp of that particular product or service. Who is the target audience? So making sure that you're writing this in a way that they will understand, and you're targeting news outlets and bloggers who have existing relationships with that particular target audience. Number 3 is very, very important, and this gets back to the fact, and I keep telling you, we need to emphasize why it's important for the audience or how it will help the audience. What are the benefits? What is the impact? Right? So this is answering the so what question. So we need to make sure that our audience knows why this is important to them. How will this make their life easier? Is it through entertainment? Is it through education? What are the benefits of them taking the time to make sense of this article? And then maybe to buy a product or a service or to engage in a different type of behavior. When and where is it available? The worst thing, in my opinion, that you can do in a press release is leave a number of questions for your readers. Right? So maybe we tell them that a brand new Fitbit is coming out, and we talk about all of the benefits. We don't tell them when, though, and we don't tell them where they can buy it. Right? Infuriating. Because if we're at a position where we decide as a consumer or stakeholder we want to take action, we believe it's on the organization to make that easy for us. You also want to ask yourself, who will be the spokesperson? And here you might identify a couple spokespeople. So we might think about who will I quote for the purposes of the press release, because you'll see that In the third paragraph of the standard press release, it's all about quotes. We might look and say, okay, we're going to quote our CEO for the press release, but then when we get to doing, if we end up doing any video interviews or a blogger asks us to come and participate in his or her show or podcast, for example, maybe we bring someone who tends to be a little bit more articulate or warmer, right? Okay, so planning our news release. Like I said, I really want to encourage you to complete the planning workshop, to take the time with the content and structure there. Once you have done that, it becomes very easy to fill in the formula of the press release. Right? The other thing, keep in mind that flowery language does not belong in a news release. It's very objective. We are sending this to a news outlet, and a lot of times these are published as is. So we have to make sure that we're writing it in a way that fits the expectations of our media channel. As I noted, many of these, whether it's because of staff shortages, because of timing, or because we've developed a really strong relationship with a news editor and they know that they can trust the press release, the writing, what we're doing and sending, many of these are published as is. So we should embed key messages, right? You'll see that press releases have a boilerplate in them, which is standardized information that helps to position our organization, so we can think of it that way. We can also, if there's a particular saying or slogan or idea that our organization is attempting to emphasize, we can make sure that it shows up in the quotes, right? And then in terms of the format, everything we do in public relations is according to AP style, not to be confused with APA style that you might use in some of your other classes. But AP stands for Associated Press, right? So if you've taken a journalism class, it's going to coincide with that style that you've done there. The 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why. And the H is how. So after you finish your press release, all of the W's and the H should appear in the news release. And I'm going to talk to you about where we expect to see them, but just know that it is your job as the writer, as a representative for the organization or the client, to make sure that this information is included. Now we're going to walk through what the news release looks like. Typically, they're composed of 5 paragraphs, but before we do that, we always have a headline. And as I acknowledged on the previous slide, how we're using objective writing here, it's not going to be flowery. This is not the time to exercise our creative writing skills. It's a time to be very journalistic. And to write in a clear, concise, informative manner. So your headline, again, very, very clear in terms of what readers, whether it is the newsroom editor, the blogger, or the stakeholders that they communicate with. Everyone should be able to look at this title and have a clear understanding of what they're about to read. The first paragraph is arguably the most important. Our press releases are written in an inverted triangle, or pyramid rather. So think of a pyramid and then flip it over so the widest part is up top and then it narrows down to the point. And we do this because the most important information is up top. And that is our first paragraph, the lead. And the reason why we do that is because editors cut from the bottom up. So that's why you want to make sure all of your most important information is in paragraph 1 and 2. Paragraph 1, this is where we're going to start to respond to the W's and our H. We're going to figure out what is most important, what do we immediately need to open with so our readers are engaged in the rest of the information. Our second paragraph is where we're elaborating on paragraph 1 and where we're filling in the rest of the W's or the H that didn't appear in paragraph 1. And so it's just giving us the additional information about the event. So maybe in this paragraph, if we've acknowledged our press release is about an event, paragraph 1 might say when and where it is, in the timeline, like when it starts. Paragraph 2 might acknowledge how long the event lasts and the cost for the event, for example. Okay. Our third paragraph are quotes. I think on the surface here, this seems really easy. Okay, I'm going to do a paragraph of quotes. But this is one where I see, at least in the beginning, a lot of challenges for students. One, because we have to make sure that we're writing a quote in a way that the individual we're quoting would say it. So if we're quoting President Dunn, for example, he's typically not going to say, I'm really, really excited about homecoming this year. I think it's going to be great. That's the way that we might say something. He, on the other hand, would talk about Western's rich history in terms of, using this weekend as a basis of unity for the campus community, right? So you can hear there the distinction between what we might, our knee-jerk reaction in terms of issuing a quote, and then taking the time to step back to think about who we're quoting, what he or she would say, and remembering that this is strategic communication. We're not just writing a quote because the press release template says paragraph 3 is quotes. We are writing a quote that aligns with our organization's missions, with our mission, with our goals, with the way in which we want to be positioned and seen by stakeholders. The other thing with quotes, for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to ask you to get client approval for your quotes, because again, everything, when we publish it on your ePortfolio at the end, it's going to say done for the purposes of COM 3480. And as I've noted a few times, your social media will be set to private when we get to that point. But when you are working in an organization, whether you're interning or you are a full-time employee, I want you to make sure that you have a system in place where you are always getting someone to sign off on the quotes. Whether it is taking a hard copy to the CEO or whoever you're quoting and having him or her initial it, whether you're doing it electronically, making sure you save that. There's an acronym, CYA, and it's a little bit crass. It actually stands for Cover Your Ass, but it really applies to public relations, because if we don't make sure that we save these instances of receiving approval, then let's say a quote isn't received well, or the media runs with it or interprets it differently, it becomes very easy for these other individuals in the organization, who likely are higher ranking than we are as a public relations practitioner, to say, he or she messed up. He or she didn't represent what I wanted to say correctly. So that's why, especially when we're quoting someone else, making sure that you have it indicated somewhere that they have given their approval. Your fourth paragraph is a boilerplate, and we'll look at that on the next slide. Boilerplate tends to be a standardized paragraph that represents your organization. A lot of times we think about it as like a brag book, a bragging statement. So we can talk about our reach, we can talk about if we've won some awards. In this boilerplate, it doesn't just show up on our press releases, but we'll see that it's probably on the back of every brochure that our organization or client issues. It's going to be on our annual report. Really, any promotional material that we publish electronically or in a traditional hard copy format is going to have this boilerplate. Many of you, if you're working with smaller clients for courses, or brand new clients that are up and coming, it is going to be up to you to write and draft a boilerplate for your client. And the fifth paragraph is contact information. So you are just reiterating in paragraph format who the media can contact, how you can be reached, right? So are they, if you want them to tweet you, if you via email, phone is still very common now, especially providing personal cell phones or work cell phones. And it's also this idea that maybe we have two people to contact. If you want to RSVP for the event, contact this person. But if you're looking for more information or to conduct an interview, then contact this person. So it's just a way where we can distinguish and differentiate if need be in terms of who's being contacted and why. I'm going to show you here a couple basic elements of the news release. Your textbook has a lot of great examples embedded within it. So this one is from the Shedd Aquarium. Some standardized things. It's always going to appear on company letterhead. You know that most of you don't have access to your organization's letterhead that you're using for your course client, but you're going to make it appear that way. So similarly as you did with your fact sheet, we're going to put their logo there. We're going to acknowledge it's a news release or a press release. What you're also going to see here is for immediate release in all caps and bold is always going to appear on your press release, as will your media contacts at the top in the stacked format that you're seeing here. Again, we have an informational headline, and we're always going to have a dateline. What's interesting here is in this example, they just have Chicago, because Chicago's well known. We don't need to acknowledge that it's from Illinois. If we have Kalamazoo, we're definitely going to have the comma MI after it because it's not as recognizable as Chicago, for example. But a lot of times our dateline will actually go next to the city. They have it beneath for immediate release. For purposes of class, you can do whatever makes more sense for you. The other thing I want to acknowledge here is that every organization, while they will use AP style, they have what they call their house style as well. So they might say our dateline always appears with our, like the actual date appears where the city, where the release originated, or the Shedd, for example, it looks like they separate the date from the city. So that's something that you will learn as you work in your internships and as you start in full-time positions in organizations. Okay, so a few other notes here. So we have the basic layout of a press release. We know what the purpose is, what it does. So now we're just going to go a little bit more in depth into various aspects of it. So we talked about the lead. Again, paragraph number 1, easily arguably the most important paragraph you're going to write in a press release. Making sure that it is very clear that we omit needless words so there isn't clutter. Tends to be 2, 3, 4 sentences long. Very, very rarely do we see a 1-sentence lead, but our book does give some examples of that. So the thing here is we're balancing between providing information and making sure that we entice the reader. So that's why we don't want to cram all of the W's and the H in that first paragraph because it's just too much information to try and make sense of. I'm going to have some, in this module, there are some sample press releases from previous students you can look at. But I also want you to think about something like prnewswire.com, or for many of your organizations, a number of you have selected really large multinational organizations. Go to their press room, look and see what they do in terms of their formatting and their template. It's going to, the more news releases that you look at, that you read, the easier it is going to be for you to create your own effective press release. On this particular slide, I'm going to read this to you, and this is an example of a cluttered lead. So I'm going to read it. I want you to think about what you would delete, what you would remove, what you would move to a secondary paragraph, and then on the next page, I'll show you how I made the lead less cluttered. So Evergreen Community College is pleased to announce a medical career education expo to be held this Saturday, March 29th, 2012 from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. Both Richmond campuses, Southside at 800 Moorhead Park Drive and West End at 2809 Emerywood Parkway, will be participating in this exciting event. So it's not poorly written, right? This isn't a terrible example, but we can see that we can easily pare it down so it is easy to access the most important information. Here are some elements that I would acknowledge could be eliminated or would make more sense in other paragraphs. So red is unnecessary text, so we can just delete this. So pleased to announce, right? That gets away from an objective communication. Acknowledge that press releases are objective. Therefore, we're not going to say that this community college is pleased to announce it. The year, right? If we acknowledge that we're holding an event this Saturday, we don't need to acknowledge it's 2016, right? People know that, so we can get rid of that. And the final thing that we would just delete is this exciting event. Again, it's sensationalized, it is not objective, therefore it doesn't belong in our lead. Now if we move to the purple, and again, this is just information that would make more sense in subsequent paragraphs. So here I would suggest moving this to a second paragraph where we expand on the lead, is the actual event location information. So we know that there are two campuses. It got a little bit wordy when we were giving the addresses of both. And at the end of the day, if we are hooked in the first paragraph, if we recognize that we want to go to a medical career education expo, we're free this Saturday, we can make it work between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., then we're going to read on to the second paragraph to see the exact location. Okay. So again, just going through these basic components, we've talked about the inverted pyramid where we're starting with the most important information, and then we are narrowing that down to other information that certainly is relevant and helps to better position our organization and provide more information about an event, a product, or a service, but remembering that editors cut from the bottom up. So we're not going to hide any important information later on in the paragraph or in the press release. That's called burying the lead. You've probably heard that used before. We want to start with what is most important. We also talked about how after the body text, we're going to have a boilerplate integrated into the press release. So I want to show you an example here. So again, these boilerplates, we're not seeing them just on our press release, but we're going to see them on other promotional materials that our organization creates. These are done as a way to quickly provide some information about who we are as an organization, what we do. Okay. So the example I've drawn from here is from the Mayo Clinic. I'll read you this boilerplate. Mayo Clinic is a nonprofit worldwide leader in medical care, research, and education for people from all walks of life. For more information, visit mayoclinic.org about and mayoclinic.org org news. Right? So what they, I believe, are attempting to do with their boilerplate is to acknowledge that not only do they deliver medical care, but they are also leaders in research. And because they're conducting this research, because they are doing cutting edge medical care, they also see the education component as key. They acknowledge also for people from all walks of life, so they don't focus on one particular group and disadvantage other groups, but rather they acknowledge that every human being, regardless of how they look, regardless of ability, financial ability, they're able to provide and willing to provide care. So like I said, many of you, if you're working with a brand new client, you might not find a boilerplate. that already exists on their website, so it will be up to you to create one. A couple other basics that you are going to see on every news release, and these are ones where I start to see students forgetting and losing points needlessly. Acknowledge for immediate release is always at the top left. The date is typically beneath it. Your contact information is going to be there too. For this class, as long as you're consistent, I'm comfortable with you either using your own personal information as the media contact, as long as you acknowledge it's part of the organization, or if there is someone for your organization who is doing that, and you've already used their name on on your fact sheet, for example, then you can use them throughout the semester as well. Again, headline here, we're making sure that it is a summary, that it is informative. At the end of the day, it is not sensationalized, but it is a clear indicator of what people can expect when they're reading this document. The other thing here is if your news release is on 2 or more pages, you're going to use the shortened aspect of the headline in the header section of pages 2 and 3 and 4, however many additional pages you have. You're doing this again because in previous days, when press releases used to be mailed in, if they were separated, so if the first page, the staple came out from the second page, they used that as a means to identify how these different pages work together. Now we know that that's not quite the way. We're usually sending these via email or having bloggers or journalists download them from our sites. But like I said, news releases are very formulaic and they are templated, and these are the expectations. So again, if we are moving on to page 2 or 3, on page 2 or 3, we're going to see a shortened aspect of the headline. Think about it if you've done papers in APA for other courses, the running head. It's kind of that same idea, but obviously you're not going to write running head. We're also going to have the dateline, again, the city in which the press release was issued from and the date. And as some additional details, press releases are always numbered. Pages are typically numbered at the bottom. You can do them at the top, especially if you're going to have more than one page. Then it can have the truncated version of your headline with the page number. The other thing too is if we're going on to a subsequent page, at the bottom we're going to write more between quotations to indicate that it's continued. Then finally, whether you finish on page 1 or page 4, all press releases end with 3 hash signs, right? 3 pound signs. So that indicates the end. And again, I want to make sure that you're looking at the sample press releases that I make available in this week's module. Sometimes now people are doing more and more online or social media releases. These tend to, one, be single space because it's easier for us to read online. It's single space. And they tend to be very, very short. If we're sending these out via email, again, we're making sure that our subject line is attention grabbing and informative. The other thing here is practitioners show us that they don't prefer attachments. Attachments can be embedded with viruses. When they're working on behalf of organizations, they can bring down a large group of computers, in one fell swoop. So having this information embedded within the body of the email tends to be preferred. We've also acknowledged that you can do social media releases. These tend to follow the same rules as the online releases we just talked about in the previous slide. News releases now, especially because most organizations will have an online newsroom or a press room or media relations link where all of their press releases are available. They're thinking too about search engine optimization. We talked about that in the previous lecture, chapter 12 it is, I believe, where it's this idea that we want to make sure we're strategically embedding words that consumers use to search with. So if we know that people commonly use like Broncos or WMU or Western to search for Western Michigan University, we want to make sure that those words are appearing in our documents that we're creating, including our press releases, and they're occurring higher up. So search engines read from top to bottom. So it is quicker for them to go through and categorize information, catalog it, when it is higher in the document, meaning that more quickly when people type in Bronco, Western is going to pop up as one of the top suggested search results. Some other tips for writing here. Again, especially now because we're making much of this electronic and available on our own website, making sure that we have additional documentation that is more likely to help our press release be picked up, whether it's in the form of high resolution photos, whether it's through a podcast, through links to a YouTube channel that demonstrates more information about the event. And maybe it's access to our logo, right? So we make sure that journalists and bloggers are using a high resolution version that we approved of. The last thing that we're going to look at here is the delivery of the news release. This can also be referred to as the pitch. So figuring out, so just because we write a news release doesn't mean that it's going to be picked up, doesn't mean that anyone's going to read it. Part of the ways in which we increase the chances are not only writing in the formulaic template that coincides with the basic formatting of press releases, but getting to know journalists and bloggers who are relevant to what you are doing for your organization or client. Once we get to know them, and again, if they're local, ask them if you can meet them for a cup of coffee, because you want to know how they work. You want to know what you can do to make it a successful relationship, a two-way communicative relationship. Part of that is saying when is their deadline, and then how much earlier before deadline do they want to receive a press release. Some will say, I want it 48 hours before deadline. Some will say, give me 2 hours and I'll decide then. The other thing, I want you to make sure that many public relations practitioners, typically those who are novices or newer, tend to get put on a blacklist, so to speak, because they gather this huge email list of all of these different writers and TV journalists and bloggers, and every time they write a news release, whether it makes sense to go to this entire email list, they hit send. Right? Well, you can realize after a few times when, let's say, Sally Smith's name appears in your inbox, she's sending you a press release. If I'm a technology writer and she's sending me a food safety alert and I'm getting something 3-4 times that is irrelevant, very, very easy to click Sally Smith is spam and make sure that I don't receive anything else from her. So it's very important that you are making sure that you are only sending this to relevant sources who are going to see this information as important, who are going to see why they should share this information with their readers, right? With their audience, with their viewers, because they have a trusted relationship that they have to uphold. And finally, too, the same way we encourage you to have a different resume and cover letter for every organization you're applying to, so you can show them that you did your homework, that you're adjusting it to fit them as an organization, as a potential employer. I want you to do the same thing here for your news release. It might be in terms of changing the headline ever so slightly. It might be in changing the body of the pitch if we're sending an email or if we're making a call in order to tell a journalist or blogger that we have a special event or new product or service we want their stakeholders to be aware of, making sure that it pertains directly to that blogger and journalist, to their audiences, right? All of this is about relationships and basic audience analysis. So again, before you dive in and start your press release this week, I want you to make sure that you do or at least review the press release planning guide and look at a variety of the sample press releases that are available to you.